Wanda Jean Mays was born in 1959 in Panama City, Panama, where her father had been stationed in the military. She grew up in Arkansas, Alabama, and Texas. Wanda graduated from Wallace State College. In 1986, Wanda worked as a secretary at Redstone Arsenal, which is a United States Army post. She started showing signs of emotional distress from a chemical imbalance. It got worse when she started dieting. On the evening of May 11, 1986, Wanda met up with her parents for dinner. Thereafter, she stopped by the home of her aunt and uncle, located on Georgia Mountain in Marshall County, Alabama. She decided to spend the night at their house instead of driving back to her apartment. Wanda went to bed just after 10 p.m., and that would be the last time she was seen alive. The next morning at 5 a.m., her aunt and uncle went to wake her up so that she would not be late for work. They found that the door of the guest bedroom she had been staying in was locked. After accessing the room, it was discovered that a bedroom window had been broken from inside the house. There was blood on the window. No one in the house heard the window break during the night. It appeared that no one slept in the bed and that all Wanda's belongings were on the nightstand. The aunt and uncle's house was next to a lake. At a boat dock on the lake, Wanda's nightgown was discovered with bloodstains on it. Later in the day, a local resident told investigators that they saw a young woman matching Wanda's description walking along Alabama State Road 62 near Guntersville. The witness said that the woman's hair was wet as if she had been swimming. The next day, a female witness from Huntersville, Alabama, claimed to have seen a woman matching Wanda's description sitting in the back of a car with two unidentified men at a convenience store. According to the witness, the woman appeared to be afraid. It turned out that the two people had claimed to have seen Wanda were both lying and made a story up. Marshall County rescuers believed that Wanda drowned in the lake. The entire lake was searched. They could not find Wanda, but they did find an empty canoe that was drifting in the water. Blood was discovered in the canoe. After lab testing, it was confirmed that the blood found in the canoe matched Wanda's blood type. In October 2004, a hiker searching for ginseng plants discovered human bones at the bottom of a cliff about 2 miles from the house that belonged to Wanda's aunt and uncle. In 2008, the remains were sent to a FBI DNA lab in Virginia for testing. The FBI was then able to confirm the remains belonged to Wanda. The Marshall County Police Department stated they do not believe any foul play is involved, and what happened was an accident. They believe that she had a panic attack, and it was so severe that she broke the window to get out and injured herself in the process. She then took the canoe, ditching it after a while and running into the woods. It was so dark outside, she did not see the cliff and she fell. Her family agrees with the police's determination. They said that Wanda would often have panic attacks and everything would terrify her. Jennifer Bastian lived in Tacoma, Washington. She was training for a YMCA bicycle tour of Lopez Island. On August 4, 1986, just after 2 p.m., she left her home to ride her bike to Point Defiance Park and go back home. Several witnesses saw her at a park later in the day. When Jennifer did not make it back home that evening, her family called the police. It would take 28 days before her body was found. A group of joggers found her body near the 5-mile drive. Jennifer had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators found DNA near her body that they believed belonged to the person who took Jennifer's life. It was believed that David Harold Fisher could be involved in the case. David ended the life of a girl named Laura Lee Burbank in the Tacoma area in 1970. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for this crime. On September 1st, 1974, however, David managed to escape from prison. It was only realized that he was gone several hours later when they counted the prisoners in the evening. Investigators believed that it is possible that David made his way back to the Tacoma area and came across Jennifer. On December 6, 1989, Jennifer's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. Some leads came in, but led nowhere. The next year, on January 4, 1990, David Fisher was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. He actually watched the episode. A day after the show aired, the police arrested him in Alberta, Canada. He was not surprised. David had been living by the name Michael Raymond Porter and worked as a door-to-door salesman. An absolutely disturbing fact is that he performed magic shows in elementary and nursery schools. David was also married and had children. His new family knew nothing about his past. In January of 1990, David was taken back to the United States to continue serving his sentence after 15 years on the run. David was investigated for possible involvement in Jennifer Bastian's case, but investigators were able to rule him out as a suspect. Michelle Welsh is another girl whose life was taken in Tacoma, Washington, just a few months before Jennifer's. The two cases have always been linked. Investigators believed that the same man was responsible for ending the two girls' lives. In 2016, however, DNA testing proved that two different men were responsible. A composite sketch was then made for the suspect in Jennifer's case, a white male with blonde hair and blue eyes. On May 10, 2018, 60-year-old Robert D. Washburn was arrested in Eureka, Illinois in connection with Jennifer's case. He had inserted himself in the investigation. Robert told investigators that he was in the park when Michelle disappeared and Jennifer. He lived less than 5 miles from Point Defiance Park and a few miles from Jennifer's house. Investigators arrested him because his DNA matched DNA found on Jennifer's body and clothing. In January of 2019, he pleaded guilty. He confessed that he abducted Jennifer while she rode her bike in a park. He then dragged her body into the woods where he assaulted and strangled her. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison. For those of you who are interested, DNA testing identified a person who took Michelle's life as Gary Hartman, also in 2018. Jane Britton was born on May 17, 1945, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was the daughter of J. Boyd Britton, who was administrative vice president of Radcliffe College. Jane attended the Dana Hall School, a private school in Wellesley. She learned to ride horses, play the piano and organ, and paint. After graduating high school, Jane attended Radcliffe College. In 1967, she graduated from Radcliffe and was accepted into Harvard. She lived in an apartment at 6 University Road. Outside of her studies, Jane enjoyed painting pictures of animals. One of her fellow students, James Humphreys, became her boyfriend. She also socialized with Donald and Jill Mitchell, who lived in the apartment next to her. On the night of January 6, 1969, it was the first Monday of the new year, and a day that classes resumed after the holiday break. Jane and James went to dinner at a restaurant. They then went ice skating. The two of them went to Jane's apartment just after 10 p.m., and James left her for the night just after 11 p.m. Jane then went next door to Donald and Jill Mitchell to have some sherry, and she went back to her apartment after midnight. The next day, January 7, was a very important day for Jane. It was the day of her general examination. It was the end of the classroom portion of her degree. When Jane did not attend, her classmates found it unusual, as she had shown a lot of dedication to her studies. James called her a few times that morning, but she did not answer. After the exam, he went to her apartment. Her door was unlocked, which allowed him to enter. He found Jane's body face down on her bed. Her nightgown was pulled over her head. James believed she was sick, so he went next door and asked Jill Mitchell if she could take a closer look. When she did, she discovered Jane's head was covered with blood and that she was no longer alive. The Cambridge police were called and started collecting evidence. They found that Jane had been assaulted. An autopsy revealed that Jane passed away due to blunt force trauma. Nothing of value had been taken from the apartment, which led investigators to believe that robbery was not the motive. A child who lived in another apartment in the building heard unusual noises from the fire escape that night. Another neighbor of Jane told investigators that he had seen a man whom he described as about 6 feet and 170 pounds running away from the building after 1 a.m. The case attracted national media attention. The New York Times ran several articles about the case for the next few weeks. After the initial investigation, no more information of value came to light, and the case went cold. In 2017, DNA was finally advanced enough so that investigators could create a DNA profile from DNA that was found at the crime scene had belonged to an unknown male. It was entered into the Federal Combined DNA Index System, better known as CODIS. This led investigators to Michael Sumter. Michael passed away in 2001. During his lifetime, he had been convicted of 2 assaults. To be 100% sure that it was Michael's DNA, investigators had to test the DNA found at the crime scene against DNA from another closely related male. Using Ancestry.com, investigators located the brother of Michael. He provided them with a DNA sample. After some more DNA testing, Michael's brother and 99.92% of the human male population could be excluded as suspects. This confirmed that Michael was the one that took the life of Jane. He did not live in the Cambridge area at the time of the crime. He did, however, grow up there and work in the area 2 years before the crime. Michael also had a girlfriend in Cambridge. This made investigators believe that while he was in the area, he came across Jane. Wendy Hallison grew up in Los Angeles with her parents and older sister Linda. Wendy enjoyed playing piano and painting. On a Sunday afternoon in 1968, 22-year-old Wendy called her sister about a newspaper ad she saw for a hairdryer on sale. Wendy wanted to hear if her sister Linda wanted to go buy one. Linda told her sister no because she wanted to spend the day with her family at home. So Wendy went on her own. She drove her prized green Thunderbird down Fairfax Avenue and bought the hairdryer. Wendy was last seen filling up her car at a gas station down the street. When she did not make her way home later that day, her family began to worry. It was unusual for her not to check in. Her mom called police that night to report her missing. Wendy's family started searching on their own as well. Her brother-in-law, Gil Court, and her boyfriend took a helicopter to scour the neighborhood from above. Less than an hour after the search began, Wendy's boyfriend spotted her car parked on Fairfax Avenue. The two of them found her car keys on the floor of the back seat and went to open a trunk. Inside was Wendy's body. Investigators determined that she had been assaulted and strangled. Her fingernails were broken, showing as she tried to fight her attacker. She still had all her jewelry and her watch, causing detectives to rule out robbery as a motive. Investigators decided to especially look into 4 men who knew Wendy well: her boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, brother-in-law, and a friend. They believed that she knew the attacker, someone who knew she was shopping alone. Investigators found it strange how the boyfriend was able to spot her car so quickly and compared it to finding a needle in a haystack. He also failed the lie detector test, which raised some more eyebrows. Investigators collected a DNA sample from Wendy's body that belonged to an unknown male, but they could not determine if it belonged to the 4 men they were looking into. In 1998, however, DNA was a bit more advanced, and all 4 men were eliminated as suspects. While the DNA was strong enough to eliminate suspects, it was too meager to test against collections in state and national databases. Wendy's parents left her room intact. Her brother-in-law Gil avoided driving down Fairfax Avenue. Wendy's father Lee stopped by the police station every few days, asking if there were any new leads. He even offered money looking for anyone who might have seen Wendy that day. The family was saddened because of the milestones Wendy was missing. It seemed like it was the hardest for her father. She was born on the same day he was, and her absence was felt every celebration. In 2016, investigators felt that advances in DNA would finally help them solve the case. They were right. It led them to Edwin Dean Richardson. Edwin's criminal record started in his childhood. It started with burglaries and escalated from there. In 1960, he was convicted of attempted robbery and kidnapping and spent 8 years in prison. He was paroled in April 1968, just 5 months before Wendy's life was taken. Investigators could not talk to him as he passed away 4 years earlier. Wendy's belongings could now finally be given to her sister, who was grateful for the news. Alex Cooper was a 65-year-old man living in Cranbrook, British Columbia. He had a wife named Margaret, and they have been married since 1952. Alex had 5 children and 7 grandchildren. He was a much-loved husband and family man. Alex enjoyed nothing more than spending time with his family and making music. From 1974 to 1986, Alex worked in the cleaning industry. In 1986, he took a job as a salesman. He had to spend some of his time on the road and would often be away from his family for days on end. On the morning of April 4, 1987, Alex's daughter Lila and her husband Pete left Cranbrook to go on a shopping trip. After they drove past the bridge, they spotted Alex's car off the side of the road. They decided to stop their car next to his and talk to him. The two of them walked down to the riverbank because they assumed that Alex was busy fishing. When they got to the river, however, there was no sign of him. Lila was concerned because Alex had a heart condition. She called her mom Margaret, who informed her that she had not seen Alex in over 24 hours. They called several hospitals, but he had not checked into any of them. The family then called the police to report Alex missing. Investigators found that his car was locked. Inside was clothing and fishing equipment. An extensive air and land search then began, but no trace of Alex was found. Investigators then decided to try and find out where was Alex last seen. They found that he had lunch at a restaurant less than a mile from where his car was found. Margaret told investigators that Alex always paid with a large roll of cash. She believed that someone saw all of the money he was carrying around and robbed him and took his life. Lila, on the other hand, believed that Alex went down to the river, had a heart attack, fell in and drowned. Newspapers and television broadcasts picked up Alex's story. This led to witnesses coming forward. They had seen a man matching Alex's description hitchhiking in the area his car was found. This made investigators believe that Alex wanted to disappear. His family did not believe that is the case, as he was a devoted family man. It would also not make a lot of sense for him to leave his heart medication and credit cards at home. A year after Alex was last seen, Margaret started to look for Alex's birth certificate. She discovered that there was no certificate issued in his name. She could also find no record of Alex Cooper prior to their marriage in 1952. This left the Cooper family in a constant state of uncertainty. Then on May 27, 1991, another shock came to the family. Halfway across the country, in Toronto, another man went missing. This man was also a traveling salesman. His name was David Cooper. David had been living in a boarding house for approximately a year. He sold meat products to families over the phone. During one of his business trips, a friend of his reported him missing. When investigators looked inside his room, they found a photo of him holding his grandchild. Investigators believed that David Cooper looked a lot like Alex Cooper. They showed a photo to Alex's family, and they were able to confirm that Alex and David was the same man. On May 29, 1991, Alex went to his room after his business trip. He noticed that someone was there while he was away. He called his landlady and she told him that she had to open for investigators. When the police went back to the room a few days later, Alex was already gone. Investigators and Alex's family believed that something must have happened in his past which made him have to disappear. On September 25, 1991, Alex's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. A viewer from Hamilton, Canada recognized Alex and called the police. Investigators located Alex in Hamilton. He told them that his real name was Albin Arsenault. In 1948, when he was 26 years old, he worked at the Union Pacific Railroad. He was accused of stealing. Alex did not want to be arrested for a crime he did not commit, so he changed his name to Alex Cooper, and 4 years later he married Margaret. When he turned 65, he realized that he would not be able to get a pension as he did not have the necessary documents. He could not bring himself to tell his family that he had been lying to them all those years, and he decided to disappear. Winston Bright lived in New York, had children and a wife, Leslie. He worked for Verizon for 20 years. On October 12, 1990, Winston called his wife from work around lunchtime. All seemed to be fine with Winston, but he never arrived home. Leslie looked for her husband for years, until she eventually gave up hope that he was still alive. Then 2 decades later, a man arrived at Leslie's door by the name of Kwame Seku, who claimed he was Winston Bright. Leslie did not believe him, however. Kwame went to court to have himself recognized as Winston Bright, but the case was thrown out since he had no way to prove it. It was only in 2018 when Kwame could prove that he was indeed Winston, when he gave DNA samples that matched his mother's and children's DNA. Kwame claims that he was stricken with amnesia, and the first thing he remembers is wandering the streets of San Diego with no idea who he was. He says he adopted his current name of Kwame Seku when he read it in a newspaper. He would only remember fragments of his previous life. In 2008, he started working as a teacher. He found out about his missing persons case online and realized that he was the man in question. He was on a trip to New York when he recognized a former acquaintance from a Jehovah's Witness group he belonged to. That acquaintance then notified his former wife. Leslie Bright said that she now believes Kwame is in fact Winston Bright, but said she did not believe his amnesia claim. She feels that Winston just abandoned them and started a new life. Irene Garza was born in 1934 in McAllen. It is a city in Hidalgo County, Texas. She graduated from McAllen High School. In 1960, she worked as a teacher at an elementary school in McAllen. Irene expressed fulfillment in her work. She was also very religious and attended the Sacred Heart Church. On April 16, 1960, Irene told her parents that she was going to confession at the church. After midnight, she still was not home, and her parents got worried, so they reported her missing. 2 days later, on April 18, Irene's handbag and left shoe were found on the road. A woman called Irene's parents, claiming to be Irene, and said that she had been kidnapped. The call was found to be false, however. A man started telling people that he took the life of Irene, but that was just an awful joke made by the man after he had been drinking heavily. On April 21, 1960, 5 days after she was last seen, her body was found in a canal in an area several miles away. Irene had been assaulted and suffocated. Any DNA evidence that could have possibly been left behind by the attacker was washed away by the time the body spent in the water. Law enforcement questioned about 500 people across several Texas cities. This included known offenders, Irene's family members, and her ex-boyfriends. The priest who heard Irene's last confession, John Whitt, soon came under suspicion. Church members said that a confession line moved very slowly on the night that Irene was last seen, and that the priest spent a very long time with her. It was also noted that John had scratches on his hands. When questioned, John denied seeing Irene that night, but later admitted to having done so. A few days after Irene's body was found, the canal was drained. There, investigators found a camera belonging to John Whitt. In 2002, two acquaintances of John, Dale Tackney and Joseph O'Brien, came forward to police to say that John confessed to them that he took Irene's life. Investigators believed that John was responsible for what happened to Irene, but they did not feel they had enough for a conviction. In 2016, a new district attorney took office in Hidalgo County, and a case was looked into again. In February 2016, John Whitt was arrested in Arizona in connection of the Irene case. He was then extradited to Texas. His trial began in November 2017. In December, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. John passed away due to natural causes in 2020 at the age of 87. Just before 8 a.m. on March 19, 1993, the police received a 911 call from a 6-year-old boy who had found his mom's body in their apartment in Toronto, Canada. Emergency services were dispatched to the building, but 41-year-old Barbara Brodkin was already gone. She had a stab wound to the chest. A lot of cash were taken, so investigators believed that the motive was robbery. Investigators looked for witnesses, examined the evidence, and interviewed over 100 people. The attacker could not be identified, however, and the case went cold. In August 2017, the case was reopened. Evidence that was collected at a crime scene were sent in for DNA examinations. This led investigators to a man by the name of Charles Mustard, and they arrested him. Detective Stacy Callan said that Charles and Barbara was acquainted, but did not elaborate. Investigators believe this case is solved, and they are not looking for any other suspects in the case. They are, however, asking anyone with more information to come forward. The body of a white female between 17 and 25 years old was found on October 29, 2006 in Kilgore, Texas. A total of $40 was found in her pockets. It is believed that she passed away between 8:15 p.m. and 10 p.m. the previous day. The unknown female was given the nickname of Lavender Doe, most likely due to the purple sweater she had on. Detectives were able to recover a DNA sample belonging to an unknown man from her body. A lot of residents started pointing out suspicious people that they believed could be involved, and an investigation started. In January 2014, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a digital composite sketch. This led to the mother of missing 23-year-old Brandy Wells to come forward. Brandy disappeared after going out to a nightclub in Longview, Texas in August 2006. After DNA testing, it was found that Lavender Doe was not Brandy Wells. In August of 2018, a man by the name of Joseph Wayne Burnett confessed to the police that he ended Lavender Doe's life. He was originally questioned back in 2007 because he lived in the area and was convicted of a similar crime. Also in 2018, the DNA Doe Project decided to try and find out the real identity of Lavender Doe. They analyzed her DNA profile and found her cousin who also lived in Texas. On February 11, 2019, they announced that Lavender Doe's real identity is Deana Dodd. Deana's mother abandoned her when she was a baby, and her father was homeless. In 2000, she left the rest of her family behind in Florida, and she moved to Texas. There she joined a door-to-door magazine sales team. It is believed that she met Joseph Wayne Burnett while working. 20-year-old Anna Marie Hlavka was a resident of Portland, Oregon in 1979. She had an apartment that she lived in with her boyfriend and sister named Rose. Anna and Rose worked at a McDonald's close to the apartment. On July 24, 1979, Anna made her way home after work at around 5 p.m. Around 10 p.m., Rose came home and called Anna's name. When Anna did not answer, Rose went to Anna's bedroom. There she found Anna's lifeless body. She had been assaulted and strangled. Detectives collected forensic evidence from the crime scene. They also started looking for witnesses. A co-worker saw her outside her apartment at 5 p.m., so they at least knew the crime took place between 5 and 10 p.m. Detectives also interviewed criminals who have committed similar crimes in the area. It unfortunately did not bring them any closer to solving the case. In 2009, DNA was advanced enough to use the forensic evidence found in the crime scene to create the DNA profile of the person who took Anna's life. It was entered into the CODIS database, but no match could be made. In April 2018, investigators learned about a new technique that was used that could help them solve the case. Parabon Nanolabs was asked to help. They took the DNA the investigators had collected and tried to find relatives of the suspect on public DNA databases. In October 2018, they found a match: Jerry McFadden. McFadden was born in 1948 in Texas. On June 4, 1986, he kidnapped 19-year-old Brian Boone, 20-year-old Gina Turner, and 18-year-old Suzanne Harrison. He ended all of their lives. He was arrested just after this in July 1986, but he managed to escape. Only a few hours later, he was arrested again after he was found in an abandoned house. In October 1999, 51-year-old McFadden was executed for his crimes. It is believed that he is responsible for a lot more crimes. Investigators learned that McFadden was in Oregon at the time Anna's life was taken. For Anna's family, the news is bittersweet. "21-year-old Leslie Marie Perlov lived in the Los Altos Hills, California. She was a Stanford University graduate, an aspiring law student. She lived with her widowed mom and worked as a clerk at a North County Law Library. Leslie was last seen at her job on February 13, 1973. When she did not arrive home, her mom Florence called the police. Leslie would always call if she would be late, so Florence immediately knew something was wrong. That same day, her 1972 orange Chevrolet Nova was discovered parked at a gate of an old quarry located near Old Page Mill Road. A few days after she was last seen, her body was found under an oak tree just west of where her car was found. She had been strangled. Investigators were able to retrieve DNA from the crime scene that was left behind by the person who took her life. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen a blonde man near Leslie's car just before she went missing. After an extensive investigation, detectives were no closer to solving the case, and it went cold. Then in July 2018, investigators learned about new advances in DNA that might help them solve the case after all these years. They submitted the DNA from the unknown male to a company some of you should be familiar with, Parabon Nanolabs. They are a DNA technology company in Virginia. A DNA profile was then created, and using genetic genealogy, they were able to identify 74-year-old John Gertrude was the person who took Leslie's life. He had previously served time in Germany for assaulting a 16-year-old girl in 1964. Investigators were also able to confirm that John took the life of Janet Ann Taylor using DNA in 2018. Janet's case is very similar to Leslie's. On the 24th of March 1974, she visited her friends at Stanford University. That evening, 21-year-old Janet was seen walking along Junipero Serra Boulevard. The next morning, her body was found by a delivery driver. Her body had been dumped by a wooded area close to a bridge just off Sand Hill Road. Investigators always believed that what happened to Leslie and Janet were connected, but only proved it in 2018. John's trial was supposed to take place in 2020, but he fell ill and is now set to take place in 2021. It is believed that he could potentially be involved in more crimes, and investigators are currently looking into it. Leslie's sister Diane had this to say after hearing about the arrest. "I've been waiting for this call for 45 years, and now that it came, I'm just a bit stunned. Not a day goes by that I do not think about Leslie in some way. She was my big sister, always looking out for me. She was and remains always with me." Tanya Nicole Kach was born on October 14, 1981 in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. She did not have a great childhood, and her family struggled financially. She attended Cornell Middle School in 1996. There, the 14-year-old Tanya befriended the school security guard, Thomas Hose, who was more than twice as old as she was. He was very popular at his school, and all the girls liked him. No other guy could compete with him. Thomas would often take her out of classes to talk to her. One day when he caught her skipping class, he kissed her. The two of them started dating. Over time, Thomas convinced her to run away from her family and move in with him, which she did. Tanya would often run away, so it took a week before her family reported her missing. The police only looked for her for a few days before giving up. No one knew that she was staying at Thomas's house. He lived with his parents and his son. He went to great extremes to hide Tanya from his family. She was confined to his bedroom and had to use a bucket as a toilet. In 2000, Thomas introduced Tanya to his parents, but he said her name was Nikki Allen. He told his parents that she is his girlfriend and would be moving in with them. After this, Tanya was allowed to occasionally leave the house, but she had a strict curfew. She soon realized that what she had with Thomas was not normal and decided that she had to get away. Tanya escaped on March 21st, 2006 with the help of Joe Sparico, a grocery store owner in the neighborhood. She revealed who she really was to him, and he called the police to go to Thomas's house, where he was promptly arrested. Tanya was 24 years old at this point. Before his trial, Thomas was put under house arrest, which is kind of ironic considering that is where he kept Tanya as well. He also stabbed himself and was taken to a mental hospital. In 2007, he pleaded guilty to the charges against him and was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Tanya wrote a book about her experience called Memoir of a Milk Carton Kid, the Tanya Nicole Kach story. In May 1998, the body of an Asian female was found on a side of the road in Spartanburg, South Carolina. She passed away due to suffocation. On September 25th of the same year, a landscaping crew cutting grass under a billboard along Industrial Drive in Mebane, North Carolina, found the remains of a young boy. It was believed that he had a light brown complexion and could potentially be Hispanic. Sketches of the woman and the boy were made to try and identify them, to no avail. In October 2018, DNA technology was more advanced, and it was realized that the boy had one white parent and one Asian parent. In December 2018, Dr. Barbara Ray Venter, who is known for her work in DNA, took a look at the boy's case. She was able to match his DNA to one of his family members who submitted their information into the JetMatch database. The boy was then identified as Bobby Adam Whitt. His family did not report him missing because they believed that he and his mom went to live in South Korea. Investigators strongly believed that his mom could have been the woman whose body they also found. After DNA testing, it was confirmed that her name was Myoung Hawa Cho and that she was Bobby's mom. Shortly after the identification, Bobby's father, John Russell Whitt, confessed that he took the lives of Bobby and Myoung. He pleaded guilty on January 15, 2020 and was sentenced to 58 years in prison. It is not known why he did what he did. Aleacia Stancil was born in March 1994 in Phoenix, Arizona. Her mom, Toni Stancil, had been having a difficult time after leaving the Air Force. One night in December 1994, Toni left Aleacia with a friend of hers, claiming that she needed a few days to clear her head. When Toni came back 2 days later, the baby was gone. She only reported Aleacia as missing the next year in March of 1995. Investigators tried to find Aleacia, but were unable to. Toni's life was taken later in the year in what remains an unsolved case. In 2008, cold case detectives developed a DNA profile for Aleacia using genetic material from her living family members. Software was then used to create images to show what she might look like in the years since her disappearance. In 2014, a woman in Connecticut walked into hospital with no ID. A nurse started searching missing persons online. She discovered an age-progressed picture of the missing Aleacia Stancil, and it looked like the woman. A DNA test was then done, and it was confirmed that this woman was in fact the missing Aleacia Stancil. She had been adopted and raised under a different name. Besides that, we do not know much about her, and it seems like she wants it that way. Arlis Perry grew up in Bismarck, North Dakota. In August 1974, 19-year-old Arlis married Bruce Perry. The two of them had moved to the Stanford University campus, where Bruce was a medical student. Arlis started to work as a receptionist at a local law firm. Just after 11 p.m. on the night of October 12, 1974, Arlis and Bruce had an argument. Arlis told her husband that she was going alone to the Stanford Memorial Church, and the two of them went their separate ways. When Arlis did not make it back home, Bruce got worried and reported her missing. Officers from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office went to the church, but found all of the doors to be locked. The next morning, campus security guard Stephen Crawford found Arlis's body around 5:45 a.m. in the church. An ice pick was sticking out of the back of her head. She had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators looked into her husband and a security guard, but they passed the polygraph test, and there were no concrete evidence that either of them committed the crime. In 2018, with more advanced DNA, investigators decided to do DNA testing on a DNA they found at a crime scene back in 1974 had belonged to the attacker. Investigators were then able to confirm that Stephen Crawford was the one that ended Arlis's life. On June 28, 2018, the police arrived at his house to arrest him, but Stephen locked his door and ended his own life. Jessica Lynn Keene was born on September 24, 1975 in Columbus, Ohio. In 1990, 15-year-old Jessica was a model student. She had high grades and was a cheerleader. Her grades dropped and she quit cheerleading, however, when she met a boy and fell in love with him. On March 4, 1991, her parents went to a free counseling center in Columbus asking for help, as they did not know what else to do with Jessica. The home for troubled teens offered residents for 2 weeks, individual and family counseling sessions. On March 15, she left the home to go shopping. Jessica was last seen alive at a bus stop at around 6 p.m. When she did not make her way back to the home, the police were called. 2 days later, her body was found in a Foster Chapel cemetery, about 20 miles from her home. She had been assaulted and hit with a blunt object. Evidence showed that she ran in a cemetery, trying to get away from her attacker. The initial investigation focused on Jessica's boyfriend, Sean Thompson. He was ruled out as a suspect, however, as DNA evidence cleared him in this case. In 2008, investigators finally got a break they were looking for. A man by the name of Marvin Lee Smith was arrested for a different case. When his DNA was taken, they found that his DNA matched the DNA found at a crime scene in Jessica's case. Marvin confessed to taking her life. He was sentenced to life in prison. 21-year-old Deana Bowdoin lived in Maricopa County, Arizona in 1978. She attended Arizona State University. On the evening of January 7, 1978, Deana had dinner at her parents' house. Afterwards, she went to a local bar with one of her friends. She stayed until just after midnight. On her way home, she went to a store to buy some milk. Sometime before 2 a.m., Deana made it home. Around 2 a.m., Deana's boyfriend unlocked her door to let himself into her apartment. He discovered Deana laying on her bed with a belt around her neck. She was covered in stab wounds. He sliced off the belt, called the police, and started CPR. It was too late, however, and she was already gone. Investigators found that her attacker also assaulted her. He had left his DNA on her body. Investigators tested this DNA sample against the DNA of Deana's boyfriend, but it was not a match, and he was ruled out as a In 2001, Detective Tom McEzaney decided to have Deana's clothing retested for DNA. This gave them a better DNA profile of the suspect. It was also in 2001 that the FBI was busy compiling the CODIS database, which gave Tom access to a national database of DNA from criminals. He entered the DNA into the CODIS database, and there was a match: 52-year-old gas station attendant Clarence Wayne Dixon. He was already in prison. In 1985, he was on parole and attacked a woman with a knife. That summer, he assaulted a female jogger. It is believed that he assaulted at least 10 women. His trial for the Deana case began in November 2007, and he was convicted. In 1966, 19-year-old Susan Galvin moved from Spokane, Washington to Seattle. She started working as an administrative employee at a Seattle Police Department. On July 13, 1967, Susan's body was found in the elevator at Seattle Center. She had been assaulted and strangled. For more than 50 years, investigators tried to find a suspect in the unsolved case, to no avail. Then in 2018, investigators decided to make use of genetic genealogy to help solve the case. They used DNA collected at a crime scene that belonged to an unknown male and entered it into the JetMatch database. This led investigators to Frank E. Whippich. He was 26 years old at the time of the crime and lived in the Seattle area. Unfortunately, there will not be any justice for Susan or her family, as Frank passed away in 1987. Susan was the oldest of 8 children. Her brother Larry Galvin made a statement after hearing that Frank was the person who took his sister's life. The loss was felt mostly by our mother, who did her best to keep us near her. It would be hard for her to lose another child. For her, the question was not necessarily who, but why. We children were young and resilient. We found our own ways to cope. As the years passed, we scattered to the winds. In 1977, Jane Morton Antunez lived in Atascadero, California. She had recently divorced her husband. Her daughter went to live with him in Oregon, while Jane went to live with her parents. On the evening of November 17, 1977, Jane left her family's home to visit some of her friends. She never made it to her destination, however. The next day, her brother David noticed as she did not come home, and he went to look for her. David made a terrifying discovery. He found a family vehicle along a road just about a mile from their home. Inside was his sister's body in a back seat. She had a wound to her neck. This was not the first tremendous loss for Jane's family. In 1965, Jane's sister had a fatal car crash. The only lead investigators got was a witness who claimed to have seen Jane pick up a man in her vehicle. Investigators also looked at a man by the name of Rudy Martinez. He had been released on parole in Atascadero after he served time in prison for assaulting a woman. Martinez was a strong suspect, but investigators did not have concrete evidence that he was involved, and the case went cold. In 2017, a cold case unit detective examined the case once again. He used evidence to create a familial DNA search. It soon became apparent that Martinez's DNA matched DNA found at a crime scene. There was a problem, however, for investigators. By this time, Martinez was no longer alive, and they needed his DNA to confirm that he took Jane's life. Investigators managed to track down an ex-girlfriend of his. She had a razor that belonged to him. DNA belonging to Martinez was then taken from the razor. It was then finally confirmed that Martinez was the one that took Jane Antunez's life. 22-year-old Kristen Swanson lived in Denver, Colorado in 1980. She worked as a waitress at a restaurant. On November 28, 1980, Kristen left work. Then she borrowed a friend's car to go home and change clothes before going to a party. Kristen never made it to her destination, however. The next day, her body was found lying across the front seat of a 1968 Chevy Malibu in northeast Denver. Kristen had been stabbed in the chest. Investigators found male DNA at a crime scene. It was tested against the DNA of Kristen's fiancé, Steve Hose, and other men in her life, but a match could not be made. In 2010, the case was looked into again. DNA was more advanced by then. Investigators decided to enter the DNA from the crime scene into the CODIS database. This time, they found a match. Roderick Elias was linked to the crime using the DNA. Back in 1980, he was on parole and living with his brother in Denver. In March of 2010, Elias was arrested in Topeka, Kansas. Investigators do not believe that Elias and Kristen knew each other before the crime. Kristen's mom and two sisters were ecstatic that an arrest was made and that justice would be served. Steve Hose had this to say: "Kristen was a wonderful, loving and caring person. She was taken from us much too soon, and a lot of people tonight are going to be very happy about this news." In June of 2011, 54-year-old Roderick Elias was convicted of the crime by a jury after a 2-week trial. "47-year-old Deborah Dalzell lived in Sarasota, Florida in 1999. She worked as an office manager at a company called KMC Telecom. On March 28, Deborah talked to her sister at around 4 p.m. That would be the last time anyone saw Deborah alive. She lived alone at 5356 Colony Meadows Lane in Sarasota, Florida. On March 29, Deborah was supposed to be at work at 8 a.m. However, she would never arrive. Her manager was concerned and drove to her house at 10:45. He found that her house was locked, car still in the garage, and her TV was on. He also found that a screen to the pool area had been cut. This really concerned him, and the police were called. Officers entered the home using a window. Inside, they found Deborah's body. She had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators concluded that an unknown man scaled a 6-foot wall, cut a screen to the pool area, then went on to assault and strangle Deborah. DNA from the man was collected from her body. It was submitted to the National Combined Index System, also known as CODIS. However, a match could not be made. Since then, numerous detectives and crime scene personnel have spent thousands of hours investigating this case. They collected nearly 100 DNA samples that were compared directly to the suspect DNA. In 2015, detectives began to research the viability of phenotype DNA analysis to help solve cold cases. Detectives contacted a company called Parabon Nanolabs. They can predict a person's physical appearance using their DNA. The system is called snapshot DNA phenotyping. In 2016, Parabon Nanolabs conducted a phenotype analysis of the suspect DNA collected from Deborah's body. This is the picture they came up with: a male, fair-skinned, brown or hazel eyes, with black or brown hair. Detectives used this information to review past subjects interviewed by detectives, develop new leads, and interview other persons. In 2018, detectives employed Parabon Nanolabs again to test the DNA against public DNA databases. Genealogical information was provided, which detectives used to create a family tree of the suspect. This led detectives to a man by the name of Joseph Fleming. Joseph had 2 sons, Luke and Jesse Fleming. Luke and Jesse lived at 5185 Magnolia Pond Drive in Sarasota, Florida. This is less than a mile away from where Deborah lived. Jesse is a convicted felon. His DNA was in the CODIS database. After DNA testing, he was eliminated as a suspect. Detectives were then able to obtain a DNA sample from Luke Fleming. After it was analyzed, it was confirmed that Luke Fleming took the life of Deborah Dalzell. On September 16, 2018, Luke Fleming was arrested in Manatee County, Florida. He was 20 years old at the time of the crime. On February 27, 2020, Luke Fleming was found guilty. Deborah's sister had this to say: "Finally, after 20 years, we have a guilty verdict in this horrific crime against our beautiful Deborah, who we all love so very much."
It's an emotional day today. I speak to you today on behalf of my sister Deborah and our family, our mother, brothers, sister, nieces, nephews, and extended family. We come from a large, tight-knit family. Sorry, I'm a bit of a puddle today, sorry. We come from a large, tight-knit family. We are spread all over the country now. We have all waited over 19 years for this news. 19 years of graduations, weddings, new babies, and family milestones that Deborah has missed. We miss Deborah every day.
Pamela Cahanes grew up in Stillwater, Minnesota. In 1984, 25-year-old Pamela enlisted in the Navy. In May of that year, she left behind her family and flew across the country to Orlando, Florida, to begin training at Orlando Naval Training Center. Sadly, Pamela never had a chance to see her dreams come true. 2 days after her graduation, in August 1984, her lifeless body was discovered in front of a vacant home in Sanford, Florida. She had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators were able to collect DNA belonging to an unknown man from her body. In 2000 and 2005, investigators unsuccessfully attempted to find a DNA match to Pamela's attacker. In 2015, investigators finally got a break. DNA from Pamela's clothing was submitted to a private forensic genealogy service. Investigators were able to access DNA profiles of individuals who submitted their DNA to genealogy websites. They found a match to a distant relative of Pamela's attacker. Investigators began to build a family tree that eventually led them to Thomas Lewis Garner. He worked as a dental hygienist in Jacksonville, Florida. Thomas was a classmate of Pamela back in 1984. Investigators had to make sure they had the right guy. They collected a cigarette that he had smoked. The samples matched the DNA found on skin collected from underneath Pamela's fingernails. He was arrested in March of 2019. A motive for the crime has not been made public yet. Pamela's surviving family members were very happy to hear the great news when investigators told them about her arrest. Pamela Felkins lived in Faulkner County, Arkansas in 1990. She worked at a video store. On February 2nd, Pamela was the only clerk on duty at a Crossroads video store. At around 9 p.m., her husband, David Felkins, came to pick her up. There was no sign of Pamela. Her handbag, keys, and coat were in the store, but she was nowhere to be found. David reported her missing, and a search party was soon looking for her. It was a cold and rainy night, which made it difficult. The next day, two of Pamela's cousins made a grisly discovery off Clinton Mountain Road. At an old dump site, they found her lifeless body. She had been assaulted. The fatal injury had been a blow to the head. Male DNA was collected from her body. Investigators asked anyone with information to come forward. A young couple told police that they left the store at 8:40 p.m. just as a man was entering it. He was a tall, heavy-set white male in his 40s with a tattoo on his left arm. Someone eating at a wagon wheel restaurant next door to the video store claimed that he saw a vehicle there around the time of the abduction. It was described as a light blue Chevrolet with a white panel and white camper shell. Everybody within 100 miles was on the lookout but never saw it. By 2018, DNA technology had advanced to the point where forensic genealogists could search ancestral databases for matches to DNA samples found at crime scenes. Using this technique, they believed that Edward Rennegar took Pamela's life. He worked as a truck driver. At the time of the crime, he lived in Faulkner County and he had been a customer at a video store many times. He had a history of assaulting women and he served 10 months in prison in 1994. In 2002, he passed away in Salt Lake City, Utah, due to natural causes. Investigators collected a DNA sample from Edward's daughter. It was then confirmed that he took the life of Pamela Felkins. Jodine Serrin lived in San Diego, California in 2007. She was mentally disabled, but a highly functioning individual. Jodine loved helping others. She volunteered at her church and at the San Diego Humane Society and was active in the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. Jodine loved animals and also enjoyed biking, kayaking, and walking on the beach. She lived alone in a ground-level condo in Carlsbad, California, that her parents bought for her. On Valentine's Day 2007, Jodine's parents went to check up on her to make sure everything is okay. Everything was not okay. Inside of the condo, her parents found a man that they did not know. They told him to leave. When they entered Jodine's room, they found that she had been assaulted and strangled. Despite seeing the attacker's face, the case would take over a decade to be solved. In 2018, investigators decided to contact the company that you might have heard of, Parabon Nanolabs. The company specializes in something called DNA phenotyping. This is a process of using unidentified DNA evidence left behind at a crime scene to predict someone's physical appearance and ancestry. It is used by law enforcement to generate leads in criminal investigations, narrow suspect lists, and identify unknown remains. Parabon Nanolabs created this image to show what the attacker may have looked like back in 2007. They also made use of genetic genealogy. This is a process where they use the DNA evidence found at the crime scene to create the family tree of the suspect. It finally led investigators to David Mebrito. He was a transient and took his own life in 2011. It was David's relatives who entered their DNA to a public DNA database and led investigators to him. The Oceanside Police Department in California was also able to help. They had a sample of David's DNA they collected at a traffic stop. This DNA also matched the DNA found at a crime scene and confirmed that David took the life of Jodine Serrin. Her family had this to say in their statement: "There was joy in her laughter, love in her heart, and faith in her soul. The Serrin family is forever grateful to the Carlsbad Police Department for their outstanding efforts in attaining justice." Denise Bolser was a 24-year-old woman living in Manchester, New Hampshire. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small company. On January 17, 1985, she disappeared, and the only lead was a note that was left behind. A few days after her disappearance, police found her pickup truck at Logan Airport in Boston. Her social security card, birth certificate, and credit cards were neatly organized in the car stall. A year after she disappeared, she was indicted in absentia for embezzling $12,000 from the company she worked for. That was all the police had to go on, and the case went cold. That was until 17 years later, in 2002. It was then that the FBI believed they found her. She was now going by the name of Denise Jones. She was still a bookkeeper and had started a new family. The now 42-year-old Denise was elated to see her family when they knocked on her door. She explained that her boss wanted to end her life because of the embezzlement. The county prosecutors dropped the charges against her because her former boss was long deceased. Denise lived in South Carolina, the Bahamas, California, and Hawaii while she was missing, and lived in Florida since 1996. Her current husband was stunned, but said a lot of things that didn't make sense before did now. His wife would always be depressed on Mother's Day and out of sorts on holidays. She never talked about family.